He will be talking for a while, and then there'll be chance for questions and answers. Judge Tatel, welcome and thank you for joining us. Tatel, you are muted. Judge Tatel, you need to unmute yourself. Okay. No, I didn't. While we're waiting for Judge Tatel, I just wanted to let you know about our two other JDEM events. On the 14th is our JDEM service, our Jewish Disability Awareness Annual Shabbat service. And on that Sunday, we will be having a panel discussion on mental health with the Dove Foundation and our own Dr. Liz Miller. So please join us for either one of those events. Okay.
While we're still waiting, I will now pitch our next Jewish Book Council author visit, which is March 3rd with Sarah Glass, the author of Kissing Girls on Shabbat, or Kissing Girls on the Sabbath. It is an incredible memoir of queerness, of Orthodox to progressive Jewry, and a bunch of really other interesting stuff that Rabbi Feldman will talk about as it gets closer to the date, because he'll be hosting that talk. Thanks, Rabbi. Yeah, I know.
I have nothing else to plug. We're gonna wait for a second for Judge Tatel. I don't want you to speak it out. No. I want you to stop. It's really what I want. Yes.
Yes, so last Sunday, or the 26th, we actually had Kara Snyder, a member who is blind and a blind artist, and she led us in a workshop showing us how her painting method, and about 12 of us did our own creations, and they will be on display for your viewing pleasure once we get past the bar mitzvah weekends. And that was the beginning of JDEM.
Okay, speak.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. This is an evening of technological glitches. Can you still hear me? No.
Yeah, they're nodding yes. Yes.
Oh.
They're muted. They're nodding
Oh,
yes.
they're muted.
Yeah.
Okay. Should I speak now? Sorry. What am I? I'm sorry. Can you all hear me? Because I can't hear you.
Did you turn the mic off? Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, we are having our own Zoom difficulties.
Now,
today. Please
all right.
proceed.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Everything is
Okay.
good. Go ahead
All
and
right.
start.
Joanna, thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. The situation is that I'm actually in my office because there was an event going on here. And instead of using my iPad for this, I'm using the computer in the office. And here, we'll get to our first question about technology for the blind. Since I can't see the screen, I can't see it doesn't have voiceover on it. So I can't see the mute and unmute button. Anyway, so Joanna came and got me back on, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And so I'm going to try something. I've done many book talks since this book came out in June. Many of them with Jewish Book Council, which I've enjoyed enormously, by the way, especially the questions I get. But almost all of them have been in the form of fireside chats. And tonight, I think what I'll do is just speak for half an hour or so about the book. And I've put together a series of passage quotes. I got this working too, by the way, of getting a few passages from the book together with some commentary, which I hope will give you a sense of vision and of its two major themes, blindness and justice. And then I'll finish up with something that's actually not in the book, which was the deeply profound experience of writing a memoir of this kind and its aftermath. And if you wouldn't mind me, if you could tell me when we're maybe 20 minutes before the end, so I can stop and answer questions. Would that be okay?
Yeah, we'll warn you. We'll keep time.
Okay, great. Okay. So let me start with, oh, I can't, hold on a minute. This is just an evening of problems, isn't it? Okay. One of the things you will see when you read my book, I hope you will read my book, I talk about the tremendous effect that technology has had on my life. But I also point out in it that when technology fails, it's a real disaster for me, as it has tonight. But I did get my computer working again, and as we get into this, I'll explain to you how I'm doing this. But let me start with, this is an excerpt from the prologue, which I hope will give you a sense of the two major themes of the book. I've lived a rich and varied life as a civil rights lawyer, as a federal judge, as a husband of 60 years, as a father of 4, as a grandfather of 8, and now a great-grandfather. I've spent my professional life in the pursuit of justice, and I could have written a memoir entirely about that pursuit. But unlike most lawyers and judges, I've been blind for more than half my life due to a rare inherited eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. Throughout my 30 years on the nation's second highest court, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, I could neither read a word of the thousands of legal briefs submitted to my court, nor see the faces of the hundreds of lawyers who argue before me. A blind judge sounds like a cliche, I know. Like the Statue of Liberty, like the statue of like the statue of Lady Justice, wearing a blindfold and holding her scales. But it's no cliche to me. I can't see, but I can listen closely. I didn't need to see the lawyers to hear their arguments, and I absorbed all the written materials by having them read to me or, later, by using digital audio devices. For decades, I fooled myself into thinking that my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now in my 80s, and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. This memoir is about my life in the law and my journey into blindness. It's also about the Supreme Court of the United States and my grave concerns about the state of our judiciary. So, beginning with the first of the two threads in the book, blindness. I was, when I was a little kid, I always had trouble seeing at night. And no one knew what the problem was until in 1957, when I was 15 years old, my mother took me to the National Institutes of Health, where I was diagnosed with what is called RP, which is a genetic incurable eye disease. I was 15 years old. The doctors told me that they didn't know much about RP. In fact, if you think about it, 1957, it was just 5 years after scientists discovered the double helix. So we knew very little about genetic diseases at the time. They thought that my sight would slowly decline, but they never said anything about blindness. They did suggest that I eat lots of carrots. I did that. That didn't do any good at all. But I still like carrots. So after I was diagnosed with this, I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't come home and say to my friends, oh, by the way, I have RP. I may lose my eyesight. I didn't say anything to them. I never said anything to them. I mean, what 15-year-old wants to be different from his friends? And I was also, as I look back on it after all these years, I'm sure a little embarrassed about having a disability. And so basically for 20 years, I never told anybody about this. But I developed lots of tricks for covering up my declining eyesight so that people wouldn't know what I was up to. And one of them, let me just give you, and many of them are in my book. Here's one of them. Quote, going to the movies with friends was tricky. I could get to my seat just fine when the lights were on. But if I went for popcorn after the lights dimmed, I had to count the seats sideways, then the rows up and down, to have any chance of getting back to the right spot. Somehow I feared my friends' judgment about my declining vision more than the decline itself. Like most kids, I just wanted to be normal. And I thought my friends would think less of me if they knew what was going on. So I began building a repertoire of strategies. Instead of saying to my friends, I can't see the ball, I made up excuses like, can't believe I missed that one, as if being a lousy ball player were better than being a poorly sighted one, and on and on and on. I kept up this ruse for years. Not until I met my now wife, Edie, when I was 23 years old. Not until I met and fell in love with her did I tell any other person about my declining sight. But even then, in law school, as a young lawyer, I kept my declining sight to myself, pursuing all the tricks I had developed for covering it up. And by that time, I graduated from law school. I was in a law firm, and I feared that it would affect my job opportunities. Not so. When I was 35, this is 20 years after I was diagnosed, I was the director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in Washington. I had three small children by then, and my eyesight took a dramatic decline in 6 months. And at about that same time, and at that point, I began to learn Braille, and I started having people read to me. But I still never made an issue of this until I went for a job interview at the law firm I'm now at. And here's how I describe what happened. The first time I told someone in my work life about the possibility I might become completely blind was in 1975 during my job interview at Hogan in Hartson. By that time, my sight had declined significantly. Edie and I had discussed extensively how I should handle the event. And we both agreed that for the first time in my life, I'd try just being open and honest. By that point, it felt like I didn't have much choice. But I'd carried the secret for so long and rehearsed the words so many times in my head that it felt like a relief just saying them. Quote, I have retinitis pigmentosa, and I don't know how much longer I'll be able to see. I explained to the hiring partner. I remember the conversation very well because it was so difficult professionally and personally. I remember the exact words the partner said in response. He didn't ask whether I could do the work. He didn't pry. he didn't even seem to feel sorry for me. He has just one question. What help will you need? Those 5 simple words changed everything for me. The defenses I had hidden behind for so many years, the worry that my declining vision would prevent me from getting a good job, all gone in an instant. I wrote this book for lots of reasons. One of them is I hope every hiring partner in every law firm, every personnel official in every corporation who hires, I hope they read that paragraph. I hope they read it and understand it. Because if they do, I hope they will change their views about interviewing people with and without disabilities. So to me, that's a critically important passage in this book. Now, although I eventually took the difficult step of getting a mobility cane, and I tell that story in the book, I still never talked about my eyesight. Not when I was director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights not when I was director of the Office for Civil Rights during the Carter administration, not when I was a law firm partner, and not during my 30 years on the DC circuit. I was not a blind judge. I was a judge who happened to be blind, and that was a big difference for me. Only in the process of writing this book, and only after learning to work with Vixen, my magnificent guide dog, who you will see on the cover of the book, have I finally come to terms with blindness. You'll read all about this in the last chapter, which is called The Dog That Changed My Life. And I assure you, that is not an overstatement. Now, before I move on to the law side of the book, I want to just tell you what I'm using here. I don't know, can you see this device? Can people see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, this is a Braille computer. It's just like your laptop, except that you use these 7 keys, which is the way you type and read Braille. What I'm doing with this is I've typed into the computer, or with respect to the passages I'm reading from the book, copied them and put them in there. And by using these keys a certain way, it reads them back to me, and I can hear it through this headset that I'm using. So think of it like an audible teleprompter. You know, when a politician is reading from a teleprompter, you know, what he's doing is he's looking at the words and reading them to you, right? Well, this is my audio teleprompter. I'm listening to the words and reading them to you. That's the way it works. And in a chapter called Turning Points, I talk a great deal about the technology that's made such a difference in my life. It is, to put it simply, a lot less difficult being blind now than it was 50 years ago. So let me go on and talk a little bit about the judging part of the book. Vision, the name of the book, focuses on the art of judging. What I call the principles of judicial restraint that distinguish the life tenured judiciary from the 2 elected branches of government. And then using the cases I know best from my years on the court, environmental and voting cases, I explain how the current Supreme Court has largely abandoned these principles and the threat that that poses to the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution. Every time the Supreme Court strikes down or reinterprets the law that Congress passes, it effectively accumulates more power for itself. Let me give you a good example. This is all from a chapter. I'm just going to give you a little background. It's from a chapter in the book called The Future of Democracy. And it's about a case called Shelby County versus Holder. it was in Shelby County versus Holder that the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, probably the most effective civil rights bill ever passed. The reason I focus on it in my chapter is that I wrote the opinion in the DC Circuit, that's my court, which the Supreme Court reversed. In other words, I wrote an opinion sustaining the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. Supreme Court, on a strict 5-4 ideological split, declared it unconstitutional. Here's what I say in the book about it. Oh, I should say one more thing. The reason the Voting Rights Act was so effective is that it required Southern states, or any state, but mostly Southern states, that had a history of discrimination on the basis of race in voting. Those states and all the election districts within the state couldn't make any change in any voting procedure, including as small as moving a polling place, without coming to Washington and convincing the Attorney General that it wasn't discriminatory. It's a dramatically successful bill. Here's what I say about what the Supreme Court did. The court began by emphasizing that the founders had intended the states to keep for themselves the power to regulate elections, neglecting to note that the drafters of the 15th Amendment, which came later, most certainly did not. Next, the court gestured to the doctrine of, quote, equal sovereignty, a seed it had planted in an earlier case, privileging the equal treatment of the states, guaranteed nowhere in the Constitution, over equal treatment of minority voters, guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. Finally, the court declared that Section 5, that's the provision of the act that required states to submit their changes to the Attorney General, was no longer necessary in light of the nation's progress with respect to racial discrimination in voting. According to whom exactly? Certainly not Congress, which had found that preclearance remained necessary when it last reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. Not only was this decision deeply unprincipled, I'm not reading from the book anymore. Not only was this deeply unprincipled, the court, after all, it ignored the 15th Amendment, the plain language of the 15th Amendment. It ignored its own earlier decisions sustaining the Constitution of the Act, and it ignored Congress's findings that the Act was still necessary. Not only was it deeply unprincipled, but it unleashed a wave of voter suppression legislation throughout the South that continues today. Now, in addition to voting rights, in a chapter called the future of the planet, I talk about the big climate change cases, the big environmental cases. And these are also the cases, I wrote many of these opinions. These are also the cases where the Supreme Court is very steadily limiting the power of federal agencies. Agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the SEC, agencies which have been so responsible for ensuring that Americans have clean water, clean air, safe financial markets, and safe drugs. The court is in the process of limiting and perhaps even eviscerating the effectiveness of these federal agencies. Let me read you a passage from the end of the chapter called The Future of Democracy, which sets forth my sort of overall view of what's happened to the Supreme Court and what we should worry about as American citizens. If you asked a few astute ninth graders which government officials had the power to answer the most contentious issues of our day, like race, abortion, guns and the environment, would they say the elected officials in Congress and our state governments? Or would they would they point to Supreme Court justices? Reasonable people can disagree about whether the public is right about the Supreme Court, but the loss of public trust is undeniable. And that in of itself is cause for serious concern. The court has no army. Members of the public and public officials obey the court because they believe in its authority. As Tinkerbell could tell you, belief is a delicate thing. Neutral judging fosters public trust in the rule of law. And that trust, in turn, gives courts their power to protect individual rights. The converse is also true. Judging that appears based on a preordained agenda, not on text or precedent or text, depletes the reservoir of public confidence. Over the last 2 decades, the Supreme Court has been draining that reservoir 5-4 decision by 5-4 decision. The book was written a year ago. Now I would say 6-3 decision by 6-3 decision. Let me say one other thing about the court and about the law, and then I want to say something about what's not in the book, and then I'd like to talk about what all of you have in mind. When I was a little kid, my father was a scientist. He was a physicist, and he took me on his scientific expeditions with him. Imagine, I mean, I was a young teenager, and I went on many expeditions, including the biggest was when I was 15 years old. I went with him and his colleagues for 2 months in the Peruvian Altiplano, where they were measuring the thickness of the Earth's crust. And they would fan out over the Altiplano every morning and take their seismographic measurements and then come back in the evening. And they created a portable seismic station for me. I was 15 years old. And my dad would drop me off on the Altiplano's at 15,000 feet. It's cold and windy. And I'd set up my equipment, and at noon I would take my measurements. But beforehand, you know, I usually had to chase away the llamas that were wandering around because, well, the llamas would upset the seismic measurements. So I chased away the llamas, took my measurements, and then went back. My father would pick me up at the end of the day, and then I would sit around with them at night and listen to these scientists talk about their findings and what they had learned and what their conclusions were. I tell you this story because even though I never became a scientist, science has been a big part of my life. I love science. I read deeply about science. I've chaired a major committee at the National Academy of Sciences on science, law, and technology. And the work I've done for the past 30 years on the DC circuit is very scientifically oriented because these big cases, particularly the big environmental cases, have a great deal of scientific evidence in them. And it's always been fascinating to me to look at these big cases and to realize, well, let me read you this passage here. Let me read you this passage. This is from the last chapter, this is the last paragraph in the chapter called The Future of the Planet. Environmental cases always make me think of my father and our last expedition together. And not just for the obvious reason that environmental cases usually involve science. I was never lucky enough to draw a case about the tendency of llamas to disrupt scientific readings. But I've always believed that the process my father and his colleagues used in Peru is the same one required to decide an environmental appeal. High in the Andes, we work with seismological data and principles of physics. On the bench, it's the facts of the case and the relevant legal principles. In both contexts, the principles themselves never change, and good judges, like good scientists, must follow wherever these principles lead. That's what judging is. And unfortunately, we see less and less of that on our Supreme Court today. So let me just say a few things about what's not in the book, and then I'm happy to go on to some other topics, or depending on the time, answer whatever questions you have. When I started this book, the first point I want to make is to talk about what an unbelievably profound experience it was to write this book. When I first started over 3 years ago, I thought when you wrote a memoir, all you did was tell your story. Start at the beginning, end up with a story. Well, turns out that's not the case. Writing this book, first of all, I had a wonderful editor at Little Brown who really pushed me to deal with issues that I was uncomfortable dealing with. In one of his notes to me, listed several issues he really wanted me to address, and he said, "Now, I know this is hard. Just think of it as the cheapest therapy you've ever had." And so he forced me to really think about issues about my blindness, about how I dealt with it. And also, at about the same time, my wife, Edie, who is a fabulous writer herself, rolled up her sleeves and helped me write the book. So we very much wrote it together, which is appropriate because although this is my memoir, it's really our memoir because although I'm the one who's blind, it obviously blindness affects my wife Edie and our marriage, and writing this book required the two of us to think deeply about those issues. And with the benefit of hindsight, we've been married almost 60 years now. We thought deeply about, why did young David Tatel cover up his blindness, declining sight for so long? How did it affect Edie? How did it affect our marriage? How did it affect we have 4 children, all wonderful adults with their own children. How did it affect our children? This book required us to think about those issues in ways we had never before. I should add, I have a friend who's a publisher in New York who published all of Jimmy Carter's books, and 10 years ago or so, he gave the Carters, both of them, a very big advance to write a joint memoir. And apparently 3 or 4 months later, they returned the check with a note that said, "Our marriage will not survive writing a joint memoir." Well, my marriage did survive it. It survived it nicely. And I am much more comfortable with my blindness and willing to talk about it publicly, largely because I wrote this book. And also, as I said at the outset, because of Vixen, my guide dog. I didn't get a guide dog until I was 77 years old. I used a cane for 30 years before that. But when you use a cane, a mobility cane, people don't come up to you on the street and say, "Hey, cool cane, how does it work?" But when you have a guide dog, everybody wants to talk about the dog and how she works. And you can't have a guide dog and be uncomfortable talking about blindness. So Vixen herself has helped me come to terms with it and be more comfortable talking about blindness. So the book is itself the coda to my story of first covering up and ultimately coming to terms with blindness. Writing the book was just as important for my views about the court. As a busy appeals court judge, you don't have time to sit back and think about the trends. You go from case to case. See, of course, you know what's going on, but the 3 years I wrote this book gave me an opportunity to reread my cases and the court's decisions and to think far more deeply about the court than I ever had before. And the result are the last 2 major chapters in the book, The Future of the Planet and The Future of Democracy. And those views are also very much a result of the time I took to write this book. Last point I want to make is just as profound as writing the book has been the aftermath. This book came out in June of last year. Since then, I have had hundreds of emails and letters and conversations with people, most I don't know, who say, I read Vision and it tells my story too. Now, a lot of these are people who, like me, struggle with declining sight and ultimate blindness, but many of them are people with other disabilities, loss of hearing, depression, physical disabilities. They all did what I did. I even met a young law student a couple of weeks ago who told me she too counted seats in the theater. In fact, she says I still do it. This has been profound for me because when I was young and hiding my growing disability, I thought I was alone. I thought, gee, there's something wrong with me. But it turns out that what I was doing was human. It's what everybody does who has, it turns out it's what everybody does. And I wouldn't have known that had I not written this book. I would not have understood that. As I said before, I wrote this book for lots of reasons. But in the aftermath, this quite remarkable aftermath of the book, I now have an additional hope for the book, and that is that I hope young people or any people who are struggling with a quote hidden disability, or in my case, not so hidden disability. And again, whatever it is, blindness, deafness, doesn't make any difference. It works for everybody. I hope people will read my book and realize what I didn't when I was 18, 19 years old, that it's okay to disclose and acknowledge your disability, that it's actually better for you and better for society in the long run if we do that. And if my book just does that with some people, I will be very pleased that I wrote it. So I've talked for a long time. I got a couple of the points about the law and blindness I could go through, but I think it would be better if I stopped and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, I think that would be great. So I would, if anybody in person has a question, I invite them to raise their hand and I will give you the microphone. And I invite you to introduce yourself in a similar way that I did at the beginning so that Judge Tatel has some idea of who he's talking to. For those of you who are online, if you will type your questions in, my co-chair, Sam, will read the questions out loud. So we're going to start, I think, with Ann Alter.
Given the current political situation, do you have any comments on a strategy for making sure that people of all disabilities, including blindness, will continue to be heard?
I think, well, here's what I think about that. First of all, it's not just continue to be heard. I would say continue to be heard and are heard better. Both of those. Unlike when I was growing up, we now have a very powerful law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a very powerful statute. And it's done a lot of good. Obviously, it's not perfect, and we still have a lot of progress to go. What I most worry about, I would have answered this question differently last year than I do now. Last year, I would have said, what we need to do is, advocacy groups and others need to make sure the Americans with Disability Act is enforced. And also, we need to make sure that the sighted community understands that people with disabilities can function at the highest level. I hope my book is a small contribution to that. As I said, I want every hiring partner and every law firm to read this book. And if they happen to be interviewing 3 young lawyers and one of them has a disability, they should just hire on the basis of merit. So a year ago, I would have been optimistic that more progress can be made. We've made a lot of progress. And so the problem now is that we don't know. This new administration is in the process of eviscerating civil rights laws it doesn't like. What it does with the disability laws, I just don't know at this point. I worry deeply that the Trump administration will not aggressively enforce the Americans with Disability Act or the other statutes that protect people with disabilities. I really worry about that. And if that happens, it will be a real setback in the progress we've made. But that doesn't mean that at the local level we can't continue to make enormous progress. I mean, the federal government's not the only act in town. There are many wonderful, supportive, effective organizations throughout the country that work, protect people, and help people with disabilities. Well, I'm sorry, I'm about to give a too long an answer to your question, but look at yesterday's. Here's an example. Here's what really depresses me. Look at the article in yesterday's New York Times about the failure of the state of New Jersey and most other states to take advantage of a major federal law that provides training to people with disabilities moving into the job market. When you read that article, I was so depressed from reading that article. Here's money, a statute, and the state and local officials who are responsible for it aren't administering it. And there are thousands and thousands of young people with disabilities who could benefit from programs they're not getting. First thing we could do is, if you live in, we should all be talking to our public officials and get them to take that law seriously. Just taking that law seriously would make a huge difference.
Okay. Hi, my name's Michelle. I'm a short, pale, gray-haired female.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I wanted to ask one thing, and now I want to ask another thing. So I'm going to say the first thing I wanted to ask, which is, how have you processed your grief over the loss of your sight? What has that been like for you? But my other question, because of what you were just saying, is, what do you think we should do about the catastrophe that is happening since January 20th? So
20th, yeah, at noon on January 20th. Yeah. Oh, the first question is, I don't think, I wouldn't describe what I went through as grief. When I was 15 years old and was told about this, I didn't think I'd ever lose my sight. It just never occurred to me that would happen. And when Edie and I got married, I told you, I disclosed to her about this. We were young and optimistic and in love, and I was pretty much functioning as a sighted person. When you're 23 years old, you don't sit around and think, okay, I'm going to lose my eyesight someday. They didn't tell me that would happen. So let me turn this off. Hold on. I don't think I ever had grief. I know, particularly when my sight was declining during those 6 months, it was really hard. And it was frightening for both Edie and me. And we talk about that in the book, up to a point. But I was so committed to becoming a civil rights lawyer that I just, I went and learned Braille. I learned to use all the technology. I was determined to keep going. Why? Well, one of the things I was told, I read a lot of books about writing a memoir before I wrote mine. And one of the things that they all say is trust your reader. Don't, excuse me. Oh, hold on. This is the security guard. Let me just answer the question. I'm sorry. I'm here alone and hello? Hello? Sorry about that. I'm in my office alone here. It's a huge office building, and the security guard was going to come get me so I could get downstairs and get my ride home. And if he calls again, I'll have to answer. The second part of your question, so there was never grief. I was lucky. Oh, I was telling you about writing memoir. It says, trust your reader. So I've told my story in the book as best I can. And if we had more time and after you've read the book, I'd love to get your reactions to why young David did what he did. I'd be curious to know what my readers think about that, because I don't know all the answers. I really don't. So on your second part of your question is, what do we do? You know, if you're a lawyer, this is a rule of law nation. We need to file lawsuits. We need now lawyers more than ever. I think for the rest, people who aren't lawyers, you know, I think the most important thing is to support the nonprofits and the other organizations nationally and in your community that are fighting the good fight. There's so little we can do on our own other than vote. I talk about voting in the book. Don't forget to vote in 2 years. That's the most important thing we can do. That's why my last chapter is called The Future of Democracy. It's the most powerful tool we have. It's voting. But in between, we can support these wonderful nonprofits that are defending the programs we care about, you know, and I'm sure there are great programs in your communities that you can support. So that's a long answer to your question. I think,
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm Mara's co-chair.
Hi, Sam.
So it is 5 minutes to 8, so that is your time check. I know
Yeah,
you-
I'm sorry I went over with my with my. I hadn't rehearsed this before. I knew how long it would take.
No, please don't apologize. It was
okay.
wonderful. We loved it. Everyone.
Okay.
I mean, I definitely did.
Okay, I was about to ask you whether you thought it worked because I've never tried it before.
It was beautiful.
If you tell me
I
it doesn't
loved
work, it was okay? All right, thank you.
Yes.
All right.
The question that we received on the Zoom says, "Hello, Judge Tatel. I'm David Harris. I teach at University of Pittsburgh Law School. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Would you please comment on last year's Supreme Court decision creating presidential immunity? Thank you."
Okay, that's a good way to end this. So I was talking about, you know, what the book, the two chapters about the court basically say that the court has abandoned the rules of judicial restraint that distinguish courts from the Congress. Things like following precedent, faithfulness to the Constitution. The immunity case is a perfect example of what's gone wrong with this court. You could look at the Constitution. You can look at every word in the Constitution of the United States. You will not find any presidential immunity. It's not there. And to the extent there are any clues about what the framers of our Constitution thought, the clues suggest there is no presidential immunity. The framers gave immunity to members of Congress for what they say on the floor of Congress, right? Speech or debate immunity. They knew how to grant immunity. And they also provided in the impeachment clause that an impeached president can be prosecuted for what he did while president. So every clue in the text of the Constitution suggests that presidents are not immune. But if you read the opinion, you won't see any of that. All you will see is the court own concern about protecting the president and his ability to carry out his constitutional functions. It's all made up. Now, maybe they're right. Maybe immunity is necessary, but to me, that's up to Congress. We should let Congress decide that. I'll say one last thing. If you want to compare this court, you want to see what's wrong with this court, have your students, Professor Harris, compare the immunity decision to United States versus Nixon, the Tapes case. Just compare those two decisions. The immunity case is split with the Democrat, all the Republicans in the majority, most of whom were appointed by Trump, with the Democrats in the minority. It's all about protecting the president. There's nothing about the Constitution. Take a look at Nixon v. United States. It's unanimous, written with justices appointed by Nixon. The author of the opinion was appointed by Nixon, and it's all about public importance of enforcing the nation's criminal laws. I think those two opinions do more to demonstrate the difference between this court and any other court than anything I could say. If I were teaching law school, Those are the two cases I'd assign.
Judge Tatel, this is Mara again.
Okay, Mara, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, you're welcome. It's a
Um,
pleasure to be with you.
We would like to know if you would be willing to come back sometime and after we've all read the book and have another conversation, because there were lots and lots more questions that people wanted to ask.
I would love to do that. I would love to come back and talk to you after everybody's read the book.
Wonderful.
And I
So
promise
we
not to give a
will-
test. No
uh,
quiz.
You will hear from Danny about
Okay, great.
trying to find another time for us to
Okay.
all get back together again. But we greatly appreciate you
thank you.
giving us your time and your fascinating life
Oh, thank you.
and sharing with us the journey that you went on with both your fight for justice and your personal disability.
Well, thank you very
And
much.
as part of our JDEM event, we just want to thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it. The next time we talk, you'll learn much more about Vixen.
And once again, anybody who would like to purchase a book, they're available right over here. If you would like one and you're online and you're a member, just put it in the
Call
chat.
security
We will
guard.
pay attention to it. Thank you all for coming.
Security
Drive home safely if the ice has started. And
Okay.
eat more.
Thank you for coming safely at the ice. 7:59 p.m. 7:59 p.m. Voiceover off. Voiceover on. 7:59.
Call security guard.
Calling security guard mobile.
Hey, it's David Tatel. I'm done.